Welcome to our service here this morning at Armenian Community Baptist Church. Our theme today, we're going on with our theme with Christianity Confronts Culture, number 3, which people will be speaking about honesty, openness and transparency. But before we really get into this theme, being Anzac Day today, we're going to take a little bit of time at the start of our service to recognise and remember. So you'll notice here, Liana has done some fantastic artwork. I think it's made. Yes, I think it was. And I think Kathy was helping as well. So well done, Kathy and Liana. It looks great. So what we're going to do first, I'll ask you to stand. We're actually going to observe in silence. And I know some of you may have done that one service, but we're going to do it together as a church. So I'll ask you to stand and we'll just do it in silence.
This is the third in the series, and the first two have been the Lordship of Christ. So we're laying a foundation. The Lordship of Christ, being devoted to Jesus Christ. And then last week we talked about underpinning all that with a foundation of prayer. Huge, universal topics. And now we're getting down into a little bit into what does it look like? What does it practically mean in everyday living? So can we bring up the PowerPoint of the sermon? Across. Here. We've got that up there. We'll get there in a second. So this is about honesty, openness and transparency. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to break it down into those 3 areas and just talk a little bit, have a few Bible verses on those. The Bible has a lot to say about truthfulness. Or, if it's not about truthfulness itself, it has a lot to say about the opposite of being truthful, which is lying. And in one passage, Jesus actually, talking to the Pharisees, he says, you guys lie because it's your native language. He says that the devil is the father of lies. And he said, and you've actually learned the habit of not being truthful. And he says, you're just copying your father, which was pretty much a slap in the face. That was a pretty confronting thing to say to a bunch of church people back in his day. Jesus also talked about, he said, people who follow God shouldn't have to reinforce what they say to try and get people to take a risk to believe them. Is that right? What were the things, I better be careful, I was just thinking, what are the things that you used to do or was said or have been said to reinforce something that you're going to say as being truthful? Do you understand that question? What are some of the phrases that people use to say this is really truthful? Yeah. Honest to God. Yeah.
Oh yeah, someone's got a fair dinkum.
Fair dinkum, yeah, absolutely. That's said at both ends. It's like, fair dinkum, this happened. And when someone hears it, they go, fair dinkum. They say, really? That's hard to believe. What are some of the other things? No kidding.
You can take that to the bank.
You can take it to the bank, cross my heart and hope to die. I'm not serious, is it? Yeah, I wasn't a scout, if I've got the right number of fingers, but it's almost like we've got all these ways of saying everyday speech, you mightn't be able to trust it. But the next thing I'm going to say, you can trust it. Cross my heart and hope to die, or if God is my witness, or fair dinkum, or truly, yeah, this is serious. I saw it on the internet, or something like that. But it actually, Jesus, he said, when you make a vow, he said, don't say, in his day, they used to swear by the altar in the temple, and then they learned how to swear by, if you swore by the altar, by the temple, you didn't have to follow through. But if you swore by the gold of the temple, you had to follow through. And I'm going, what they've got rules on how to commit to being truthful that you don't have to follow through on. And what's going on there? And Jesus said, look, my people, you should just be able to say yes or no, and you will have lived a lifestyle that people go, they are truthful people. Does that make sense? I mean, this isn't rocket science, is it? And yet, we're going to get in a little while, we're going to have a look at how we bend the rules a little bit as well. Jesus said, let your yes be yes. Paul in Ephesians said, in Ephesians 4, he's talking about how you can live as a new creation in Christ, or live the old way of life, and he says, put on your new nature, created to be like God, fully righteous and holy, and his next words, so stop telling lies. It's like you are a new creation, and Paul's first words on what does that look like? Stop lying. Just tell the truth. Be trustworthy, be honest, be someone, if you said something, they're not going, oh, I don't know about that. Let me read to you Psalm 24, which is the next slide. And this is thousands of years ago, David writing, says, who may climb the mountain of the Lord and who may stand in his holy place? Now that wasn't a mountaineering exercise, this was an analogy to say who can come into the presence of God? Who can stand either in the temple or there wasn't a temple at this time. And then he says, he answers his own question. Only those whose hands and hearts are pure, who do not worship idols and never tell lies. Now, holy life, holy and righteous living, you go, yeah, we expect that in church. No idolatry, in other words, faithfulness to God alone, and that's pretty standard. And the other thing, all the things he could have said, he could have talked about your finances, he could have talked about our marriage relationship or our faithfulness or our sexual integrity, we could have talked about being conniving or all this kind of stuff, but the next line just says, and who never tells lies. So for thousands of years, the heartbeat of God has been that his people, if they say something, they should have that kind of reputation where people go, that's truthful. I can rely on that. And I don't know that we can make a decision here in this room to change the whole face of Christianity. But I do want us to make some decisions today to change our lives and the lives of the people who gathered here, so that we would start to build that culture for us. That when we speak, people are not going, oh, they're just protecting their own back. They're not serious. So no lies. The next, so we've got no lying. Jesus, go to 2 slides. That's it. Truthful communication. My mother used to have a few sayings. One of them was people who tell white lies go colour blind. Okay, not bad, is it? And isn't it interesting? We now have a colour-coded system for lying. Okay? Now, I'm not sure whether it's black and white. I think that was the other thing. But white lies, they were okay. They were lies we told with good intention. The classic. I saw this written somewhere. I didn't invent this, but it says, and there's a cartoon of a woman who says to her husband, does my butt look big in this? And then 3 acceptable answers. No dear, no dear, no dear. And it's an example of a white lie, isn't it? It's like, well, that's something that, but this will bring in that. But the question is, aren't there things that people ask you and you're looking for, you don't want to tell them the straight out truth, have you been in that situation? If you haven't lived. Because most of us have been asked awkward questions and we go, look, I can tell you the truth. Was my singing in key? We really appreciate the attempt you made. Sometimes that's what you say. And sometimes we start to then, rather than just the white lie or the black lie, we seem to have a whole gradient. And pretty soon, what's white for you is actually not white for me, and vice versa. And it's, it starts out like a thin end of it. Another thing that's reported back from my grandmother, who used to say, you can tie a thief's hands, but you can't bind a liar's tongue. I knew someone who was caught in that dilemma, wouldn't tell a lie. And so if someone rang and they would say, oh, tell them I'm not here. And this person would go, I'm not going to lie for you. That person would then bolt for the front door. Once they were out the front door, the other person could say, so-and-so's not here at the moment. I think, the white lie, the grey stuff. Because in one sense, and this is where it tricks us, you can tell the truth in order to deceive. Are you aware of that? You can tell the truth in order to deceive. When Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness and the devil came to him, the devil quoted scripture of Jesus. He quoted it accurately, but he quoted it out of context and out of the intent. He was using truth to lead someone towards sin. So we've got to be careful. Being truthful is wonderful. We've got to start there. But if then we select which parts of the truth we tell and which parts of the truth we withhold, that's not truthfulness. That's using half or a portion of the truth to create deception. And that is rampant for good reason sometimes in church, sometimes not so much. Let's go on to, so we talked about honesty, let's talk about openness. Openness is obviously linked to honesty, but this is about how guarded are we and how much do we hide, hold back and conceal. Now, some of us are quite open people and some of us are more private people. I'm not trying to say that being a private person and being cautious about what you say in a group is wrong. But when we live our lives where we are unhappy for other people to know what's in our lives, not just for personal embarrassment, but for the sense of shame, then something is wrong. Something is wrong. And again, Jesus says, let your yes be yes. All you should have to do, all we should have to do, is to say, if I'm committing to that, or if I'm telling you this, it is both truthful and I'm not trying to hide or deceive you. Selective truth-telling that I talked about before happens in conflict. So many of you know, I'm trained at various levels in mediation and conflict management. And once you get up from the most basic level of conflict, what starts to happen is people start to be careful about what they say to who. And as parties and different groups form, they will talk about the parts of a situation that reinforce their stand, and the other group will force it, and sometimes there's 2 or 3 groups. And what happens is we talk only about the good things about our position and won't acknowledge the good things about someone else's position. And that's selective truth-telling. And we need to be careful that we don't do that. And I've seen some of the worst cases of that in the old days, not in this church, but where we had a meeting to try and make a decision, and someone with a strong opinion would talk about all the negatives about doing something and would refuse to listen to any of the positives, as if they didn't exist. Friends, that's not openness. That's manipulation. That's trying to win people. The unfortunate thing is that lawyers and politicians, these are the tools of their trade. If there's a defence lawyer, he will not want any truth coming out that will harm his client. So he only asks a set of questions that will bring out the bits of the truth from the witness that reinforce his argument. And he'll quickly pass over any other. And they don't like it if they ask you a question and you don't answer the way they want. So I'm told, I don't have a lot of experience in this. Although, let me tell you, as a pastor, a lot of people will try and get me to come on site, to get online, follow their theological position. And they ask those questions that they want a certain answer to. So, one of our, I'm taking a bit of a risk because I'm not, in one sense the Bible tells us to honour those leaders above us, and I do want to honour those in government. And yet at the same time, one of the politicians a few years ago, I can't remember his name, when he got caught out with just a blatant lie, he made this statement. Lies are just one of the acceptable tools in any politician's toolbox. How many of you are surprised at that? Are shocked? Well, I would never have thought that of a politician. I don't see a single hand. Because politicians, even the Christian politicians, you ask them a question about the budget and they'll tell you about the employment rate. Why? Because they don't want to answer that question. They're being truthful, but are they being open? Sometimes I don't listen to politicians get asked the question. I don't care whether I agree with the answer or not. I just wish they'd answer the question they were asked. And the more cynical, of course not me, say, how do you know when a politician is lying? He's awake. His lips are moving, is the answer that I heard, but much the same thing. What a sad situation when the people that we entrust with sometimes life-changing, certainly life-affecting decision-making, we have just got to the stage where we accept that even the best of them are at least selective truth, and some of them are outright liars. One of the worst criticisms I've heard of people leaving a certain church and going to another church is you'll hear the phrase, I got sick of all the political games. Don't want to do that. I'd rather have an awkward conversation and teach us to have awkward conversations than be politically correct and deceptive. Does that make sense? I hope so. But, having said that, respect and confidentiality is a different thing. So, when we say openness, when we do anything at leadership, we send everybody on leadership, they're always CC'd on everything, even if it's not a decision that they're involved in, because we want all of leadership to know that. So, some of you may know that Baptist churches work on a thing called congregational government, so they have meetings once or twice a year, a couple times a year, to make decisions. There are minutes of those meetings, and anyone is welcome to have the minutes of those meetings. Okay, we're not hiding them. If anyone wants to know where our budget sits, you are welcome to ask that question. It might take you a week or so to get the documents, because some people love that. I am at the other end of the scale on that. And as long as the debt collectors aren't here, I'm happy to live often in blissful ignorance. So I'm not a spreadsheet person, but some people, that gives them a sense of the finances being dealt with in a responsible manner. If that's you, you are free to ask for that information. We'll gladly give you that information. We won't give you the minutes of the leaders' meeting. Not because we're scared of you knowing that, but on occasions, we're dealing with issues that are sensitive to people, and we choose not to make that information open for anyone who's interested, to protect and respect them. Do you see the difference? That when we operate out of a desire to protect another person's reputation and their integrity, we may be a little bit more guarded in saying, you can have access to that information, but we will tell you that's not appropriate for us to share that. We won't just try and hide that. So, I don't know, you come from different environments and different cultures. Tell me a little bit, just a couple of people, give me an example. Is the culture that you work in, was that what we would classify open, or was it somewhat closed and restricted? I don't know the answer to that, so.
It was meant to be open, but in practice it was closed.
Okay. So they spoke the language of being
Talk
openness?
of the walk were different, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Others, or you've all been in fairly open kind of situations? I've seen some smiles that say no. This, okay, I won't push that any further. And the other thing we need to say, so confidentiality and respect are different. They want to come in, we want to act in love as we are open. But the other thing is, let's not trade openness as an excuse for gossip. Because just as the Bible is quite frank and very clear about don't tell lies to people who are open, telling the truth about someone else that damages their reputation is not truthfulness, that's gossip. And it is from beginning to end of the scriptures, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it's treated like one of the most despicable and the most horrible things that someone can do. Where you talk maybe the truth about someone else, but it brings the opinion of that person down, it lowers them, it degrades them in that sense. That's unacceptable. And if you ever get in that situation, often it takes a lot of guts. And isn't this one of the ones where the white truth, the white and grey, where you're hearing stuff and you're sitting there, have you ever been in a conversation where you felt uncomfortable because it's felt like gossip? Just the two of us. I think the rest of you are lying. On a certain, well, come on, on a certain level, have you never been in that situation where you think, oh, this is really close to the line, and you felt uncomfortable, but you don't want to cause a fuss, and that's hard, isn't it? And what we need to do, even as the culture, is learn some phrases. And sometimes, either pointing out the good in that for that person, or sometimes to say, yeah, that's probably not an. How about we stop and pray for them now? That's a circuit breaker. But isn't it a good thing to do? And praying for God's blessing upon the person you're gossiping about realigns our hearts, as well as invites God in the situation. Or sometimes you just got to say, actually, I think maybe that's a conversation that I'm not comfortable with, or I'm a bit worried that we could easily drift into gossip. Now, your head might be saying we're already there, and maybe that's the gracious, and maybe that's a white lie, but you're kind of going, let's not go there. So openness is not an invitation to gossip. Jesus let's go to transparency. Integrity rather than hypocrisy. Jesus often said, or said on a number of times, don't be like the hypocrites. That was a pretty confronting phrase. Who did he mean when he said hypocrites? Church leaders, Pharisees, Sadducees, the religious elite of the day, he referred to them as hypocrites. Now, the word hypocrites is a term drawn from drama. It's what they used to do is they would literally have a face mask, often on a stick, and they would hold it in front of them and act in a certain way. And then when they took the mask off, that person was gone. And so Jesus, when he calls the Pharisees hypocrites, he's basically saying, you are two-faced. We're never quite sure what we're getting with you. Which mask have you got on today? The holier than thou mask, and yet you break all the laws. So Jesus is saying, don't be two-faced. Be the same person on a Sunday as you are every other day of the week. Because honestly, openness and transparency is about we don't play games and we don't pretend. Does that make sense? It seems fairly logical to me, and yet what I've seen and I've observed over my many years in ministry and in the church is it seems like there's ways of behaving that we wouldn't do during the week that we would do on Sunday, or vice versa. And I'm going, do they see the same person? If your workmates or your work people were here today, would they see a holier version of what they're used to? You know? And if the church people went with you fishing or shooting or golfing. I reckon golfing tests your golfing. Is that right? Does mine. Do they see the same person that they will see here? See, that's about transparency. Many years ago, I was part of a church, and there was a person who was actually a leader in that particular church. And every Sunday he would be there, always had his Bible with him, always followed the sermon, would check up your scripture readings, would comment when you did it, would say, oh, it's great. Only to discover that on the side he had a long-term mistress, and that he was in the process of about to abandon his family, that he basically kept on almost starvation rations. He was so tight with his money that he had thousands upon thousands of dollars, and he was about to take it and start a new life with his mistress. He had an adult family, or from teenage to adult family. You understand what two-face looks like? To be one thing, the pillar of the church, and living this kind of life. And when one of our elders just went around and pleaded with him about changing his course of action, he just said, I'll resign immediately from the church. A very sad situation. There's more to that story we got in Leeds, but yeah. In the last 7 days, I had a talk with someone, and they said, we got told this Sunday our church is closing. I said, did you get any notice of that? No. I said, wow, because he said, no. I said, did you see it coming? He said, we've known things have been in the wind somewhat. And the phrase he used was, there's a lot of information that we're not allowed to know about. And my heart just grew, because I lost some time last week just sitting and letting him tell the story. This man's service to the church that they closed without consultation, without openness, without transparency. And we've got this guy, and I assume it's replicated in all the other families who have given and served in that way. Now, I've been part of having to close churches, but to do it in an open and collaborative way, rather than say there are things we weren't allowed to know. It just struck me on the Sunday that I was about to preach on this. So we talked about having open books, open minutes, sometimes communication. So, just keeping connected is one of our ways of being transparent. You probably don't need to know everything, so sometimes when you read that, you're probably going, only half of it's relevant to me. Well, that's good. Because our commitment is we'll give you more information than is required. We're not trying to drown you, we're just trying to say we want to live as open a kind of system of leadership and a system of church where we're not trying to hide things or do things behind closed doors, so to speak. One of the challenges that I was confronted with when email was first coming in was a friend of mine who said, don't use blind CC. You know what blind CC is? So CC means carbon copy. So if I sent Guy an email and I wanted Kev to know what was in it, I would send it to Guy and I would CC it, carbon copy it. So Kev knows it was sent to Guy, he's been included. Guy can look at it and say, Kev got to see it as well. There's a thing called blind CC, BCC. You seen that? And basically that means if I can have a conversation with Guy, if I blind CC Kev in it, Guy has no idea that Kev's listening in or being included. Now, it's quite common. You use blind CC in a good way. If you're sending out a list of prayer points or something like that, you use blind CC so someone can't capture everybody else's information. That's a good use of it. But the person that said to me, he said, never use blind CC. Never write an email that you fear becoming public. Really changes the tone of your emails. And a really good kind of piece of advice This is where it hits the ground. So I don't know that we're chronic liars, but I think we often do things that just help us not to be honest, open and transparent. In conflict situations, one of the early casualties is communication. And one of the early ways to build back restoration in conflict is to start to open up communication and get people to both communicate and listen. And so honesty, openness and transparency are key aspects for us. A number of years ago, 2017, before we were members of the church, we did a visioning process and ended up coming up with that vision statement that's up on the blackboard there. 2017, I ran a number of seminars for the church then, and we identified what were some of the top values. The third highest ranking value for this church that they rated themselves was honest, open and transparent. Now I have no idea of whether that was aspirational, that's what they wanted to be, or whether it was, but the church then saw themselves that that's the way we operate. And my hope and prayer is that that would never fall from the list of our highest values and indicators of who we are. That honesty, openness and transparency are just naturally assumed. So what does that mean? It probably means that I'm longing for a culture where deception is considered completely inappropriate. Not that we beat people up, but it just becomes an environment where truth becomes the norm and deception becomes very, very rare. That's the culture that I would love to see in our church. It's the kind of culture where when we ask an opinion, we're not asking you to agree with us. We're not trying to win an argument or get you onto our side of a point of view. We genuinely do want to know what are both the positives and negatives in this. And we want to give you a voice even when you say things that we may not agree with. That's okay. We're not trying to make everybody robots. But we want the ability also that if you have an opinion, to be able to speak and put out there as well. So I hope my prayer, my expectation and my commitment to you is openness, honesty and transparency. One of the things, and I've never been challenged about this, I don't know whether you'd feel nice to say this, is that happens with pastors. They say, oh, you were preaching at so-and-so today. So there's a problem in the church, and so we have a sermon on it. We've got some young people and we think they might be sleeping around, so we do a series on sexual integrity. You know, and we kind of look, you know, and people start going, you're preaching at me, and my commitment, I will never do that. And if I do that, you come and you challenge me. Because I think I'm big enough, secure enough and ugly enough to raise it with anybody in a tactful way. I won't use the pulpit as a place to beat anyone up. Okay? I don't want to be that, I don't want to let other people do that. And if I'm drifting in, and the other reason I say it, because if you're sitting there going, oh, Peter's talking about, you know, finances again, and he knows that I haven't been tithing or something like that, that's not true. What I do want to turn around, if there's a bit of a stirring or unsettledness, I'll be really happy for that with the Holy Spirit. But I'll make this commitment to you. I won't preach against individuals from the pulpit. I may want to have a really serious conversation with you one-on-one, but I won't do that. And I don't want other people to do that. I don't want us to pretend to be holier than we are. There's a bit of a grading, you know the grading for music? If you're at the front of the stage, you've got to have your spiritual life right up on tap. So keyboard players, they've got to be pretty sharp. Singers have got to be pretty sharp. We want We want guitarists to at least be middle of the range. If you're a drummer or a bass player in 90% of church, it doesn't matter how unspiritual you are. You guys better these. Come on, what's happening here? Why is there some kind of anointing zone in worship?
Penny, can I say something?
Not just yet. I'll come back to you in a second, all right? Can you hold that thought? Now, I don't know what your family situation is like. I don't know what you've experienced. Maybe all your life you've been told when someone says, how are you doing? To say, fine, thanks. I know June was part of a church that she went out the door one time and many years ago. The pastor said, how are you doing? She said, not terrible or not real good. And he said, that's lovely, thank you. Because we say how are you doing. When someone tells us they're not doing well, we might go, oh, I've got things to do, you know. But maybe we need to even be honest with others. And it's not about laying a big burden on someone. What it is about is learning to say, I've had better days, I'm doing okay, but it's been a struggle. And you don't have to tell your life story, but that's not even practicing a little way, pretending we're okay when we're not. Because I've been in some churches that they go, no one cared for me. And I'm going, because no one knew. No one knew how life, because every time anyone asked, you said, fine, thanks, fine, thanks, fine, thanks. We need to be honest. I know, because we will become that kind of church. Cheryl, you had a question or a comment?
Just on what you're saying, while I was in hospital, there was a lady there, an elderly lady there. They used to say something that upset me. She used to say that people should go to hell for what they're doing and saying. And it really upset me and angered me. I pulled her up on and said, that's something you should never, 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 never do. Tell people that they're going to hell. And I struggled with it. I really struggled with it. And she struggled with it as well. And then I realised the Lord died to save her from that. You know, I shouldn't be saying don't do that. What I should be saying is do this.
And Cheryl, did it end up?
And so I just went from that stance to loving her and saying, I love you. And the moment I said, I love you, there was peace. Okay. I had peace again.
That's good. We're going to leave it there, Cheryl. Thank you for sharing that. Okay.
The Lord said I could tell you.
Yeah. And what Cheryl was just talking about is, remember what I said when the gospel we talked about what if we pray for the person? When we actually respond to the people who are speaking against, sometimes some terrible things said about me in churches. I've been accused of preaching the devil's doctrine, all kinds of stuff by people that had never said it to my face. They weren't part of our church, they were other ministers, by the way. So when I said, can we have coffee? He said, no, I argue theology with you. I said, neither do I. So I'd just like to have coffee with you. Just say, if you've got an issue with me, maybe talk to me first. The irony was, he told these people to stay away from our church because I preached the doctrine of demons, and about half a dozen of his congregation came to see what that was like the next week. So not very much. But the other thing that I made in other churches that I've been part of is the commitment that we won't speak negatively of any other church. Doesn't matter what they say about us. We will treat them like brothers and sisters. Not pretending what they're doing is right or wrong. We're not just going to sit in judgment. But we are not going to be a voice of criticism to other brothers and sisters. And to tell you the truth, I hate reading books. Don't give me books that's putting down another Christian or another church's point of view. I just hate them. I don't will. I'm not trying to be ignorant of the situation, but I just don't like fueling arguments between brothers. Anyway, I was going to say I was starting to preach. I shouldn't be able to do it. Let me pray. Lord, in some ways, this is such a basic thing. We should all know this, and yet Satan, even in the church itself, has sought to make us less, or have reputations of less than absolute honesty, openness, and transparency. That there are not. Let us be a people who don't hide, that are open enough to realise we will get it wrong, and maybe it'll take a loving suggestion to point out that. But let us be people who bring honour to your name. We don't want to play the so-called political game. We don't want to tell half-truths and dishonour your word by talking about one part of Scripture at the cost of another. I pray that one of the hallmarks will continue to be honesty, openness, and transparency. Amen.